First of all, welcome Mary and also our guests that will reflect on the pre-recorded interview that we did before. We're not assuming that you've all been able to watch the pre-recorded interview, but I hope you will afterwards. First reflection is going to come from Gary, and he's going to give us also just a quick overview of what we covered in the video so that you've got the context. So, for those people who don't already know, Mary's a professor of strategic leadership and character research at the Ivey Business School, Western University in Canada. Gary, who'll do the first reflections, as I mentioned. Elliot is a governance expert recognized by the American National Association of Corporate Directors. Just so very briefly, welcome, Mary, and welcome to Elliot and Gary. Let me begin then by asking Gary to share his reflections.
Okay. So first, to state the obvious, we're all kind of prisoners of our own experience. So my enthusiastic admiration of Dr. Crossan's work is obviously going to be colored by my experience. And the most similar experience I had was from 2004 to 2014, working with the United States military on leader development. And, Dr. Crossan will be able to correct any misrepresentations by me that are colored by my own biases. In my work on leader development and non-traditional military operations, the biggest insight we had was that the most important learning occurs together during shared experiences inside and outside of work or formal tasks. Most participants in a community or shared experience are constantly looking for meaning and what occurred, often in extemporaneous conversation with each other. So, that could be, the apocryphal water cooler discussions to, discussions in pubs where maybe most of the significant stuff gets done, to formal after-action reviews or God forbid, meetings about meetings. In this way, we are always developing what Dr. Crossan describes as character in the context of a common culture. We do this as we make sense of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are the objective of learning events. And as the director of military instruction at West Point often said to our colleagues, there's no neutral. We are always developing character for better or for worse, whether we intend it or not, and whether we attend to it or not. So our most important conclusion was that instructional innovation can focus on changing the conversation in which we learn together. So that's the bias I bring to this work. Now as for my summary of Dr. Crossan's work, it's I'm not going to go into details of cases, and hopefully that will motivate you to, at the very least, listen to the entire 90-minute interview because it's wonderful. And Dr. Crossan has many cases from well over 20 years of research to give examples for what she's talking about. So let me start by asking the question, is Dr. Crossan's work practical? I think yes, for a number of reasons. One, from a theoretical perspective, she provides an explicit character framework for character that's based on millennia of practical wisdom, or even something that can be derived for a particular organization. In terms of praxis, character, she makes the point from a large body of empirical work that character is observable in behavior in a common context, most notably where there are consequences for others. Now, with that sound theoretical framework and methods of observation, character can be an actionable topic of conversation at multiple levels of the organization. So yes, the work is very practical. Why does the work matter? Her research and that of others has shown that character is at least as important as competence in its effect on outcomes valued by most organizations in business, sports, and the military. She makes the point, an important point, though, that character is a disposition for virtuous behavior that can be developed strategically rather than some abstract or immutable quality of a person. The framework that she provides gives us a language for talking about observable behavior, and importantly, behavior that's grounded in common experience. It provides a grounding for communication, collaboration, and even 360-degree assessments. Can Dr. Crossan's work help in character development? Yes. I mean, I think what she shows is that observation of behavior that reveals character is available in micro moments that occur daily. And those daily opportunities for reflecting on behavior can be like exercise and physical training. And adherence to that reflection, which is essentially a character exercise, enables deliberate practice and character development. This practice, and the concept I like to use, the phrase I like to use, is educating the attention. It makes you aware of things such as the effect of your physiological condition, your physiological status, and even your emotion experience on the actions that you take and the meaning you make of a common situation where your character is going to be displayed in your behavior. What is the most important nuance in Dr. Crossan's work, from my perspective? One is that character is always being developed, whether one attends to it or not. Now, again, that's my bias from my own experience, but I think I read that into her work. And it is influenced, for better or for worse, by what she refers to as the architecture of an organization. And the architecture of an organization for me includes all those forums and formats and systems for interpersonal coordination and operation. So it's the command structure of an organization. It are the conversations that happen up and down the command chain. It's peer-to-peer learning. All the forums that enable interpersonal interaction and meeting making are in a sense the architecture of organization. And most importantly, the culture and the structure of those forums can provide incentives or even disincentives for what you might consider appropriate or even good behavior. And therefore, they can influence character development in ways that may not be obvious. And so reflecting on the relationship between the architecture of the organization and behavior that is shaped by the various aspects of an organization is exceedingly important. The other thing that nuance in her work that I really like, because it goes far beyond the work that I did with my colleagues, is that each attribute of character in her framework kind of has a sweet spot. And with respect to that, there can be deficiency or excess of that character attribute as represented in one's behavior. And I think that's an enormously actionable and important insight that everybody can relate to. So, one thing you can do about that is sort of to sort of shape behavior to be closer to that sweet spot, but you may not always want that, and it may not always be possible. And so therefore, she makes another very important point that different character attributes can balance each other when one character attribute is away from its sweet spot. And she's got lots of nice examples to talk about that. And I will extrapolate a little bit from that, and going back to my own experience. And I think the way character attributes can balance each other, and actually allow for excess or deficiency, um, is in a group. So one doesn't have to do it within one's own character attributes. That the character attributes of a self-organizing group, whether that's a small group of 3 to 6 people, or whether it's a large organization where hundreds of people are convening for collective work. I think different individuals can bring um, the the sort of a perspectival diversity that naturally flows from our own biases, which may be in those deficiencies or excesses of particular character attributes. Um, and then the final thing I'll say about I mean, it's a couple things because I just learned about something today. So one is um, Dr. Crossan's work is actually has implications for how we develop and interact with generative AI. And this could not be a more important current topic. And she has a Forbes article recently that addresses that issue. So how can we apply character attributes and the concept of character to AI? And again, once again, in the context of discussions among a group of people about character attributes and its development. Can the interaction between humans and AI provide, opportunity to shape interactions with AI uh, to develop character, as opposed to expecting AI itself to have character attributes that we would find desirable? And the final thing I say, which is one thing I learned today, is Dr. Crossan has a Forbes article out today, which addresses a very timely and important topic that's really on the minds of a lot of people, and about which there really should be a lot of conversation. And that is, and I'll let Dr. Crossan say more about that, but it really gets to the point of um, how can people become a leader of a nation or one of the wealthiest people on the planet um, by when they seem to have deficient character, or character that we wouldn't consider to be admirable or worthy of a role model. There are a lot of important issues there, like, so how do occasional but very salient events from role models influence our character development in relation to the conversations we can have with people on a daily basis about the ways in which, or the extent to which, our behavior reflects character that's desirable in our communities or in our organizations. So that's my summary of Dr. Crossan's work, and I'll let Mary tell me the ways in which I've strayed a little bit.
I'll hand over to Mary and very diplomatically put on your last point.
You did not stray at all. It's like, I thought, I'm glad we've got this recorded because you could just write this piece. It was a very, very lovely, lovely summary. And I don't want to take up a lot of our time going forward, because it'd be great to get people talking. But I want to reinforce several points that you did make. I've been 40 years at the Ivey Business School working in strategic renewal, like, organizational learning, improvisation, innovation, understanding the role of leadership in all of that. And it wasn't until I'm embarrassed to say, stumbled into character in 2008 with the global financial crisis, that I realized we had just missed this incredibly important piece of the puzzle. And Gary, you're absolutely right. All of the points you make are right on. From a theoretical standpoint, I often say there's nothing more powerful than a great theory. I wrote this piece around the aerodynamics of leadership, that the way we've been treating leadership around style and incompetence, it's missed this piece around character, which is like the aerodynamics in flight. But there's an engineering to it. When you get to the practical side of it, it's not just seeing this framework and understanding that there's 11 dimensions and 62, behaviors that go with it that operate in a virtuous and vice state. It's that engineering that it has to go into. So how do you develop it? How do you select on character? How do you promote people on this? Why, for in governance, Elliot, you're thinking about your side of the table for boards of directors. How are they going to attend to the character of an organization? And the piece that I'm going to offer at this point that I think is really important is that many people get this. They'll see this. We get them, as we say, across the temporary bump of understanding that character matters, then it's important. And then as leaders in an organization, we quickly get, but it scares them. And why does it scare them? Because they don't know enough about it. And they're saying, so what do you mean I've got to select on character? I thought I knew what it was until I was actually charged to do it. And it's there that we begin to see the gap, right, between knowing what character is, understanding what it is, and, we keep trying to close the gap. We do everything. Every time somebody says, yes, but can you do this? Can you do that? We keep adding, more evidence, more practice, more tools. So for example, the app that I developed with my daughter, Corey, who's at the Oxford Character Project, and her expertise, of course, her PhD was bringing exercise science to the development of character. Gary, that point that you really pick up, it's daily habit. We're always becoming something. We knew we needed to crack that nut because there's not a lot in leadership development that has that quality of who are we becoming. You have to go to exercise science to actually understand how to do that. All right, so we've solved for that. We've embedded everything we know about how to develop character, the science of habit development, into a mechanism to do it. And even with that, it scares people. It tells us it has been such a blind spot that until you start to step into the space, the void of it, to reduce the worry, that we can't do it or don't know how to do it. I think that's really, Gary, I think that the proof is more in the pudding. As people start to do it, they see it. I want to maybe just pick up on 2 points on the AI side. Shannon Valor's work on the AI mirror is great because it brings that perspective reminds us that AI is a reflection of our character. Like everything that is embedded in AI reflects the character of our humanity. So any imbalances that we've had in our life and in our world will be reflected in AI. So we need to understand what that mirror is and what has been reflected in AI. So that becomes an important one. And this last piece, Gary, that I think that you raised about the article that I published today, people are really discouraged about the quality of leadership that's out there. And I thought it was really important and timely to write about that. Why is it? How do we explain that leaders are rising to positions of incredibly influential power with incredible imbalances of character? Well, number one, it tells us we didn't really understand character in the first place because it should not be happening in organizations. We have to course correct on organizations. Like there's that piece, shame on us. Boards of directors, regulators, you name it, business schools, educators, we got to course correct because we've got to solve that problem. The political front is a little trickier, but I think people are still kind of perplexed about, well, it's all about results. If people just get results, that's all that matters. And what we do I talk about is that results are really tricky. I try to get my accounting colleagues to really weigh in on this because many times results are like a ticking time bomb. we see it with Enron, Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, Boeing, that these imbalances of character can lead over time to these sort of fragility of organizational decision making that eventually, leads to some real, tremendous problems. In the article today I wrote, and I gave the example of Elon Musk, who has been touted, right, for some of the exemplar decision making that he's had in some areas. And yet, you also see what happened with Twitter. And so what we try to pick up is that with leaders where you've got clear strengths and weaknesses of character, there will be imbalances that create compromised judgment. And I write in that article, it's a little bit like, driving the car and not checking your blind spot. If you don't know what your blind spot is and you're not checking for it, it's just a matter of whether or not there's a car in it as to whether or not there's going to be a crash. And that's the problem around looking at leaders and going, everything's just fine. Well, there just didn't happen to be a car in the blind spot. But there is lots of evidence of, what happens when we're not risk managing right around character. So I will pause there, and I will also pick up, Dr. Crossan, drop the doctor, just Mary. We're all, kind of in this thing together. So I'll pause there, Paul.
Yep. Okay. Thanks very much. Well, before we go to a breakout, is there anybody who want to ask a question now? Anybody's got a burning question from what they've heard so far? We can just deal with a few. Okay, Anthony, I think you've got your hand up. Yeah.
So we'll go with Mary. What we just discussed on the political end, I kind of see in the safety world I work. Sorry, that's Augie the German Shepherd over there protecting the house. I feel it's like the Swiss cheese hole of errors, right? It's accepted at the top, and you get to the middle, and there's complacency and believing that it's not going to happen to me. All those organizations and companies and a financial situation that happened now, the American government and my friends who are on the other side of my position believe that you can do whatever you want to do and it's going to be all right because you're telling me what I want to hear. You're not telling me what I need to hear. And that's a challenge. But on the other hand, I think on the organization, and most organizations, and in the fire service, I'm talking about organizations from 50 to 300, even though we have bigger. But most of them, the character thing really does fit in. And we have a dichotomy of politics. We accept this in politics, but we don't accept this in business. And we can't get people to see the two. So I guess one, we really have a challenge getting people to understand that there's a failure coming, and they don't want to hear it until they see it. But two, we can utilize character, and what I want to know more, which Jamie knows I talked a lot about, is how do we really measure it? And we're starting a mentoring program for new firefighters. These are volunteer firefighters, and there's, I think, 8 or 9 of the character attributes were already built in. Well, we built them in, and the way we built them in was opposite. What didn't we want to see? And then we turned it around the other way, and 8 or 9, and I'll have to find them for you, the character attributes were built into the measurement process or assessment and development process for these new firefighters.
Mary, do you want to respond to that? Then Pete's got his hand up.
For sure. So, I want to there's some really important points to pick up on there. Many organizations have bits of character, and I think that's almost more dangerous than anything. So, and some aspects of character, we have an article under review right now looking at character and competence and how it predicts promotion potential. And on the competence side, lots of things came into competence like courage, persistence and tenacity, nothing around humility. And I've got this study underway looking at the 5 I's in the military, which I think, Gary, you might find interesting in their leadership doctrine, what aspects of character do they tend to overweight or underweight. And I think we want to start right from the, and you would, I think you'll be really interested in that study, Gary. There's incredible imbalances about character that then manifest into leadership development. It manifests into, well, what are we going to assess and measure? So I think that getting the architecture, we talk about it like the anatomy and physiology of the body. Let's just start with that. Let's understand what that is. Let's understand we can assess and develop it, and we can understand what those imbalances are. I'd like to also join that to Jamie's comment about, the dark triad. And, what's very interesting in the article that I just published today, I talked about that we often see a lot of two types of character. There's a lot of imbalanced character. I put myself in the same category. It's like, for sure, I'm constantly working on developing courage and drive and transcendence. And does that outpace my temperance and my humanity? Yeah, I got to keep those things really in check in my exercise program. What we find most often is that leaders didn't really understand how their potential virtues were operating like vices. So once they see it, once they know there's a development program, they're pretty excited. Remember, this applies personally and professionally. They want to be a better parent. You know what? They want to be a better partner. They want to be a better person, right? In terms of bringing that sustained excellence and well-being. So there's a lot of motivation to do it. Fascinating, though, the very few instances where we get leaders, what we call compromise character, imbalances that they either will not recognize or don't care to change. And those people, when they are in positions of power, are lethal. And I want to maybe just give us put a little bit of an asterisk around it. In the article, I talked about how do you deal with a leader in that position. Now, look at in our organizations, we have to do the risk management on this. We cannot afford to have those leaders in our organizations. In elected positions, that's a really trickier one. And one of the pieces of advice I've been giving to a lot of people who ask me about this now, they say, well, how do I deal with this? I'm in a negotiation, a person is really entrenched, this compromised character. Number one, you cannot fuel the imbalance. A person who lacks justice and humility and maybe a broader accountability to society or the world at large, you are not going to course correct on that in a negotiation with that person. The last thing you want to do is bring these elements of, well, this is just and unfair, and your ego is getting in the way. It's like, no, because you're just going to exacerbate the problem. You're going to exacerbate the imbalance that leads to further compromise of judgment. So unfortunately, where somebody is in a very significant position of power and they're in that compromised character standpoint, they have to be dealt with quite delicately, not to exacerbate the imbalance that's there. And we hope that in our systems of society, we can balance that out. Let's return to the more promising area of development, because that compromised character, they're going to be there, but the big vast majority that we're going to deal with in organizations is the imbalance which people did not actually see. It's like the physiotherapist. You got to go and say, that kind of shoulder injury I got, where is it coming from? Well, we got to do that, right, with respect to character. I'll give you my own example. The month of February, I've been working on the dimension of transcendence, following a lot of the social media that Corey puts out on that. And I've been working on the appreciative behavior. I have a lot of behaviors in the 62 for me that veer to the excess side, but not appreciative. It's rare for me to actually, it's in the awestruck is the excess vice. And there's a part of me that's going, I need to feel the boundaries even of that excess state to know that my appreciative behavior is as strong and as powerful as it needs to be. And so this roadmap of character and its development allows me to, begin to kind of work around the sophistication of what does it take to become more appreciative, and how do I know if I'm in the excess state? So sorry, that went on a little bit too long in response. I know, Paul, you said it had
No,
to
that
be
was
shorter.
yeah, but that was good. I'll ask Pete to ask his question, and then Mary ask you to respond to that. And if there's one more quick question before we go to a breakout, I'll take that. But otherwise, we'll go straight to a breakout. Pete, you're muted at the moment, Pete.
Hi, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Mary, and also thanks, Gary. I thought your intro was wonderful, so well, beautifully considered. My name is Pete Tommond, and um, I'm a recovering academic now, founder of an agency called Clever Together. And in my agency over the last 15 years or so, I've been helping large, quite institutionalized organizations engage with their colleagues um, to ask themselves the question, what behaviors do we really need in this organization to uphold a positive culture, and B, the kind of culture which will help us deliver our objectives? And I bloody wish I'd met your work earlier, Mary, because forgive my tone of language. Because what I did recently is I looked at all the 98 behavioural frameworks that I've created under values. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Suddenly got noisy
Yeah.
where I am. Yeah. I've looked at the 98 behavioural frameworks that the clients I've worked with that we've co-created, and analysed all of those, and landed on, from the ground up, a not dissimilar framework to your 11 characteristics. It's a slight different flavour, but unsurprisingly very similar. And these are the frameworks that I've worked on with very public service organisations, public sector, public service level organisations. I'm getting to my question here now. The question I've got is that the bit inside my data, which I don't see loud and clear in yours, but this is where I'm new to yours, so you'll correct me, is this word dignity. And there's something about dignity, really honouring people's dignity and making a commitment to that, that seems to be a kind of foundational part of this. That I've not yet seen in your work, but I'm new to it. So that's part one. Could you talk a little bit about dignity? And the second part is, when I've helped organisations to create these collective agreements by bringing thousands of people together to say, this is the behaviours we want to uphold. This is it may be a kind of like a new way of thinking about our character, but certainly our values. I get a response from the cynical people saying, are you asking us to be like corporate robots, fitting into the same framework? We're human beings. We bring our own values and this kind of stuff. I just wonder what your response is to that when you encounter this, because I'm sure you do. As soon as you put a framework up, people think, oh, flex, I need flexibility, So I just wonder, on one hand, this piece about dignity, on the other hand, how you can use a framework like this as a beautiful tool without making people feel like you're dehumanizing them almost. You're asking to be a corporate robot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, very good. So it probably is really helpful to realize we are standing on the shoulders of giants in the work that we did on the developing the character framework. So Confucius, Aristotle, Plato, Ubuntu philosophy, indigenous seven grandfather teachings. Some of the heavy lifting happened in 2004 with Martin Seligman, former president of the American Psychological Association, who wrote Character Strengths and Virtues, an 800-page research book that helped to identify, here are the criteria that establish a behavior as virtuous in its orientation. So I do think when you're going to really tackle something like elevating character alongside competence, you want to be on really solid sort of science foundation. So it doesn't surprise me that you find resonance, as most organizations would. I do find it dangerous when organizations, because we get a fair bit of this, it's like, oh, let's just pick and choose the character dimensions that matter. We're saying, no, let's go back to the anatomy and physiology of the body. We know what this looks like. Let's get on with it. I want to also acknowledge that because we used an engaged scholarship approach, bringing theory and practice, we were talking to practitioners. There's language that had to also be sorted through. So under humanity, the word love was there. Under the Peterson and Selling, we had to take that out because in organizations, people began to debate, well, what is that? Romantic love, what is it? So empathy and compassion, for example, cover the theoretical space of love. And I kind of get it in there by doing things like this, saying, you know, in the original work, love is there. You know, if you want to see it there, it should be there. If you have trouble with it, spirituality under transcendence was there. How to take humor was under transcendence. Very interesting. Great humor, you can see it would be really valuable, but you can also see it's debatable. So that's a bit of a long-winded way, Pete, of getting into dignity itself. I see dignity as both a manifestation of many of the behaviors associated with character, certainly the empathy and compassion that come from humanity, but some of the humility areas where, you know, dignity and interconnectedness under collaboration, you know, where you think about what is it that creates dignity with another human being, we might actually think about it even as an outcome measure. It's on the well-being side. So I don't think it would be missing with respect to, it would be very consistent with a way of saying, you know, we're looking at, you know, dignified, what does dignified, magnanimous behavior under, you know, understanding humanity. These would be other things. How do we treat people in a way that's gracious? You know, so those are a couple of things that I would say. Now, the corporate robots, super important. Really, to me, I'm passionate about this one. These dimensions, you know, it sits there on a piece of paper almost two-dimensionally. But if we understand that who we have become in our life is an expression of these, so that we actually then begin to figure out, how did I become someone? As I was talking a little bit before we started, you know, I come from a family of 8 brothers and sisters with 10 years difference. My experience of collaboration, sharing a room with 2 of my sisters for most of my life, you know, means that there is kind of facets of my who I have become and shaped, and there's like 1,000 things that make us different about this. And I do feel that in the whole diversity and inclusion agenda, which sometimes gets just a little clunky only on, oh, it's gender, race, sexual orientation. I mean, look, at these things matter. But what also matters more deeply is the individuality that we bring, the core beliefs that we bring that affect how we lead and who we are. And I think the journey of character development really becomes one of an exploration of that individuality. And while people fear that there could be this sort of robotic aspect, you get into it and you realize it's nonsense, because, you know, understanding, as I just gave my example about my appreciative behavior, how did I become this person over time? What are the things that continue to daunt me in being appreciative? Those are going to be different for me than they are for you and for everybody on the call. And that's sort of the journey, right? Is that we've got, like our bodies, physiology. You know, we know that we have similar anatomy and physiology, but we're so different.
Hopefully that answered your question, Pete. We've got a philosopher on the call, but he's on the move, so probably can't contribute at the moment. I'm not quite sure. But he will be very interested in what you've just been saying and the names from ancient philosophy that you just mentioned. But I'm sure he's trying to say something if he can. I think we'll move to the breakouts though, and if Julian is in a place where he can, join in the conversation afterwards, I'm sure we can listen to what he's got to say in response to what's just been said.
Can I just, Paul, maybe add one quick comment before breakouts? I want to pick up Jamie's point about leadership, because this idea for us is character is about character leadership is the disposition to lead. So it applies to everybody. This is why this stuff applies right down, as your parent, what are you developing in your kids? You're developing, like we can't opt out of this. We need to bring the best of ourselves to what we're doing for well-being. Now, if you have a position of leadership, you certainly need character, but I wanted just to reinforce this idea of which Jamie picks up on the aspiring leader, but the fact that this disposition to lead, maybe, Paul, that was just an important clarification before the breakout.
That's fine. I'm glad you're keeping an eye on the chat. Well, Gary's going to pose a question for you to discuss in the breakout, and we'll just break out for only a short breakout, maybe about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for, well, your feedback, followed by Elliot. Gary's just getting ready, I think. Are you ready to go, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay. So what was the question you wanted the group to think about?
So the question I wanted the group to think about was, in about 3 minutes, I'd like each participant in the breakout to try to remember and talk about a situation where there was dialogue with other participants about behavior and a shared experience, and a way that something could have been changed or sustained in the future to be consistent with a shared culture. And without the dialogue being just simple flattery, or certainly not an ad hominem attack or criticism. And again, that could be, a water cooler conversation, a pub conversation, or some formal after action review.
Does anybody have any questions about the question before we go into the breakout?
Could I see whether, Gary, this is aligned with what you're asking? Kind of more like a friendly amendment. Because when I'm think about how I would answer that question, there's a very interesting piece because we pose this a lot in that scenario. If you understood these facets of character, can you change? Could you change the nature of that conversation?
Yeah, I like that.
Are you good with that? Because
yeah,
I'll just add that we often think about, if you understand somebody's character, you can do behavioral forecasting. You can predict their judgment. And that in this water cooler conversation or scenario, if you have clarity around the nature of somebody's character, could you be doing something to alter that destiny of the inevitable?
I like your friendly amendment because, look, I mean, the most important thing that we discovered is that these conversations are going on all the time, often outside of learning events or work tasks. And it was very clear that meaning is being made, character is being developed, right? And the reason why your amendment is important is because we came to the conclusion that we need to change those conversations. Your amendment is important because you need a language. You need a framework to talk about those things you'd be talking about anyway, but in a more constructive, developmental way. So, that's why we tried to impose our framework on those conversations and give people practice with them. So yeah. So, I mean, the question is, I suspect everybody has had those kind of experiences where they've talked about. And the reason I'm asking the question is I want people to realize just how common these conversations are. And the final thing I'll say about this, and I think this is really important in a B2B context, right, is Mary is not asking organizations to add workload to what they're already doing. This stuff is already going on. It's just going on in a haphazard way. So, a framework that people can use that can sort of provide a vector to the development of character, is enormously important.
So Lynn in the chat's done what I was just going to ask Mary or Gary to do, which is summarize it in a sentence or so. And I think, can you just check whether that sentence makes sense? Can understanding of character change conversations and how interpersonally and in real scenarios? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I,
yeah, that's a good sentence. Um, Again, just like realizing those conversations are going on all the time. So I'd like people to reflect on the conversations they've had in that way.
yeah, yeah. And how understanding this could change them.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll allocate to rooms now. See you back in about 15 minutes. Okay, welcome back. So, shall we just have some reflections on what came out? And does anybody want to be brave and begin? Otherwise, I'll pick on somebody.
I can, Paul, do a
Okay.
quick synopsis and of our group, because I thought it was interesting that Tony brought up, originally it wasn't the water cooler conversation, Gary, it was even about coaching. So it was this kind of interesting comparison between, we can have a water cooler conversation or those kinds of things, but we'll continue to tread the same water if we don't pair that up with the coaching that course corrects around the fact that those conversations are always seeming to be derailed because somebody's ego is getting in the way, or they're right. So I thought it was important for us to kind of pick up that there's this nice pairing between, sure, we can activate on character in a conversation, but that won't be a substitute for the ongoing work on development. And Tony raised, I think, a really important point, which we haven't talked about yet. In the development of character, there were 4 big systems: physiology, affect, behavior, and cognition. And that's where people would start to bring up emotional intelligence, all of those kinds of things. Our physiology is that if we want to get past the one time, we weren't our best self in character, the development of character then requires us that kind of deeper dive into these systems, into the dimensions of character. And so we need to be thinking about that work around coaching. And Jamie gave us a nice 25-second synopsis of it at the end, right? To bring our better selves to a situation. What I think also came up out of the group, which was really important, is, in particularly in a water cooler conversation or those kinds of things, it's not about us using necessarily the language of character. Sometimes you can. Particularly with people who know it, it's like, oh, there's my, excess decisiveness coming into play, in a check, you can begin to use that. But most often it is thinking about what is it that required in a situation where, as an example, how often we don't really have transcendence in a conversation. We've got into being on the hamster wheel of just, doing something and rote basis, but how can we be inspired and purposive and optimistic and creative and future oriented? How do we activate on that in a conversation so that we see a possibility where one did not exist? And there, I think just this idea of positive character contagion, because you can have negative character contagion, right? We get people get really narrow, but recognizing that positive character contagion, Gary, is exactly when we become intentional about it, using all of those spaces to create a different conversation than we would have had previously. So the last point then, though, just always thinking about, with character, there's always this really positive space. There's so much that, even though you're using deficient and excess vices, you could be thinking about how do you lean into something that is positive for somebody, as opposed to using, kind of a stick mentality for what somebody needs to do. That was pretty much, I think our group, Tony, Jamie, Bill, Julian, anything to pick up about that?
No, you're happy with that. Okay, good. What about one of the other groups? I can't remember who was in which groups now, so somebody needs to speak up.
Pete, would you like to summarize what happened in our group, or
I think
Elliot?
I was about to say, I reckon Elliot should. I've already spoken in front of everyone.
Well, I'm going to be speaking. I'm going to be talking later. So why don't you go ahead, Pete?
Very kind. So, firstly, just a shout out to Savius, who was travelling whilst on the call. So it was difficult because the background noise to hear him. But thank you for persevering in our call and joining in the conversation as much as you could. Um, yeah, I don't even know where to start summarising our chat. All I want to do is say, Mary, can you please stop for dropping thought bombs into everyone's brains and exploding? Because I think that was just, we could have done with another few hours. Do you do this to everybody that you meet? I don't know, what was lovely about our chat was that we had these different perspectives, and what I can say from the bit that the bit that sort of stuck with me was of course my lived experience of some of this, and the challenge that I face is one of how you can take a framework like this. I can see how I can take a framework like this as an individual as an individual leader into conversations and say, hey, can I call you in for a chat before, about this? And like we could do those one to one, and I can see these conversations, beautiful conversations everywhere. I also know that at large scale corporate cultural transformation, it feels like people really need to own these sorts of frameworks in a deep and profound way to be able to have those conversations at scale. And to me, the best way I've seen that happen is to co-create those frameworks rather than to be handed something and then like learn it. And that's the tension for me in this. It's just something about I can see this on a one-to-one at scale. So how do we do this at scale to create really deep and profound ownership to shift those conversations at scale? And it's that was something I was connected to, but also what we all experience with teams who have these extremes of character, what that impact is like. And Elliot's shared some experiences in the corporate world, and I thought that was fascinating. And we could go on. Like I say, thank you for the inspiration, Mary, for some great conversation.
Lynn, are you going to?
I can start on the final group, but maybe Glenn, I'm going to ask you to just pipe in at the end for a bit of variety. So we talked about Glenn opened up with kind of the Chinese earthquake of 2008 and just being called there and just having to respond to such devastation, but also in the context of the Chinese Communist Party and its views, and just how there can be like this cultural overlay that makes things really difficult. And then I had Peter on talking about how working in sort of the UN system, and there's values there and they line up pretty well, but in practice, often they don't. So it's just so that was, and it is kind of like the values and then the actual real life, like sometimes there can be a difference there. And Darren talked about how, kind of having your own house in order character is really important. And then the context of those conversations changes, like why you're having them, with whom. It's so dynamic. It's so context specific, and just the real, the awareness of that. I brought in sort of thinking of my work as a facilitator, like, does a group have character? And I think it does, and so what I do is like everybody has their individual one, but together they kind of create something else. And I wondered whether it was related to culture. So I was interested in that, Mary. But when I think about it, I kind of call in character traits, like, let's look at this, let's take this attribute. How does it apply to some a situation, and Glenn made the connection of that kind of approach to appreciative inquiry, because I was saying, like, I try to move things together positively as opposed to play into the more negative reverse aspects of some of those character traits. So yeah, those were some of the things I picked up. Glenn, may I ask you just to do a little footnote on it? Thanks.
Yeah, we got into a discussion of how one actually tries to implement the idea of character, the psychological safety involved and that, and how one needs to distance oneself or remove oneself, or the degree of humility one needs, and how to recognize that each of the individuals in the group that Lynn just spoke to have how do we build, recognize, develop their own heroic courage so that they can achieve what they want to achieve in that group, whether it's the growth of their character or it's the outcomes of the group. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Peter, you were in the same group. Did you want to add something? I noticed you were particularly raising your eyebrows as well when Lynn was talking about the UN. So I don't know whether you wanted to say something too.
No, ideally, I think what we discussed was that sometimes personal values tend to override groupthink, but we're of the view that I think we need to, first of all, in this case, look at the values that shape the organizations we lead, on the basis of which we can then be able to mold the nature of character responses that are more effective in leading the organization.
Okay, I'll ask Mary to respond to what been said so far, if you've got anything to add. And then we'll move to what Elliot's reflections on the interview that we pre-recorded was.
Sure. I put in the chat this multi-level character article. So we ended up tying character to a framework that I had developed many, many years ago around organizational learning. There's individual, group, organizational. So it was this really sort of sound kind of theoretical multi-level scaffolding of this work around organizational learning. And then we brought character into it. So we talked about character activation at the individual level, character contagion at the group level, and then embedding character at the organization level, which is back to, Gary, the kinds of things that you talked about, our HR systems. When we think about how we hire, how do we promote, how do we select, things like risk management, where's character in our risk management? It's in our strategy, all sorts of the non-human side of the organization. So I want to pick up on that. The last episode that we did, Paul, we covered a lot on values, and in my field of strategy, values was of course a very central piece, but we continue to see I call it the failure of values. It is, we've been doing this for decades and decades, right? Trying to say, here are our aspirational values, and the same thing with culture. Here's our aspirational culture, but we're not working on the development of the character that underpins those values and culture. So usually I never mess in an organization with what their values are, nor even how they want to define their culture. But we have this piece that is coming out, picks up on the old, it's attributed to Drucker, but apparently it's not him, but nobody knows who did say it, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And we wrote this piece that says character eats culture for breakfast. That ultimately the culture of an organization will be a reflection of the character of the individuals in it. These imbalances, high accountability, low collaboration leads to these, failing to delegate, around in all sorts of dogmatic kinds of behaviors in organizations. So that values piece for me is we got to get below, we call it the roots of the tree system. Who are we in the development of our character that can embody that? I want to just go back to then the one piece, Peter, about the scale. And I will argue fairly strongly around this. It's a very dangerous space to try to then start to cultivate your own framework about character, because that's what got us into trouble in the first place. It's in the article I have in Forbes, it's like the elephant, with different people, different perspectives describing the elephant. So I work in the sports sector, And, it's all about drive and compete and this and this and this. And they didn't understand how strength and humility can actually enable that really strong drive to operate in its highest level. So my recommendation about this is, take the anatomy and physiology of the body, just treat it like that, and use the beauty of our differences and new possibilities around development. So I look at, for example, in the 7 grandfather teachings and thinking about, so they use the word wisdom, whereas we use the word judgment as a replacement. Aristotle would have called that practical wisdom. But what are the practices, indigenous practices that create somebody and foster being a wise person? What can we learn about those traditions? And I think the diversity and interest and the nuance about how we could be so different would come there. But the scale side for us is, keep the framework solid that way, and then of course things like, the app, that we know how to develop it, but the conversations are where you get the customization of how does it apply to an individual. So that would be my response on, the combination of what you keep, retain as a core versus where you get the customization and the differentiation.
Okay. I see that Julian Begini's now with us in a position where he might be able to actually take part and is not on the move. So before I ask Elliot to share his thoughts, I don't know whether there's any burning questions from what you've heard so far, because you've been listening in all the time, I think. You want to go after or before?
No, I managed to sort of chip in at the breakout, but I think I've got some comment, but it doesn't, not a natural place for it now. So I'll save anything for.
All right, I'll move to Elliot. Ask for Elliot's reflections. So Elliot spent a lot of time in the corporate world in several different companies, mostly large multinational corporations, and in a number of different roles, but is working and advising in corporate governance quite extensively. So Elliot's take on this will be coming from that direction, I think.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mary. So let's just go back to how Mary and I met a couple of years ago when we shared the platform for the onboarding orientation of the Board of Governors of Western University. I was asked to come in by the chair of the board to talk about governance rules, and Mary was asked to talk about character and the work that she had been doing. And I was point blank blown away by what I saw, because it made me reflect on what I had experienced and what I had thought I knew about myself and people I worked with, and it gave it a framework. There's so many things that come to mind, and I just wanted to share a couple of things. One is that there's always this debate, and Mary talks about it a lot, about do we make choices between character and performance? And I have talked to executives, and having worked within, at a very senior level, a number of large multinationals, and then working with a number of large multinationals in different countries as a consultant. You say to people, people need to be hired more for character. And they go, oh, don't forget performance. And my response is, character will determine your performance. And I use an awful lot of Mary's framework to talk about where we can shift and get performance short-term versus very long-term. In my own case, my career, a lot of it, I believe, I rose up the corporate ladder because not only my performance, because of my character. And the organizations that I worked for early on, not only did they like my behavior, it led to performance, and I was considered a good leader of people, a manager. It's different from a leader, and my performance. And then I ended up at a company where everything changed rapidly. A new CEO took over who basically pushed out all of the, and I will call it the good characteristics that had let people succeed. And as Mary talks about it, this leans so far to things like aggression, performance, ruthlessness, comments from the CEO that I like people who take no prisoners. And how that had affected so many people and changed the character. I recall being in a meeting where one of my colleagues said to me, "The barbarians are at the gate." And you could see it happening so quickly. And a number of very senior executives started leaving on their own or being pushed out because they were considered quote unquote weak, or in Enron terms, they didn't get it. And what you mean didn't get it is you were asking questions that might be considered character questions that were quote unquote slowing down the organization. So that happens, and I'm always amazed how fast it happens. What also amazes me is when we talk about exemplars in the literature of different CEOs, and one that always gets referenced is Alan Mulally, who at one time was the CEO of Boeing and then became the CEO of Ford. And he stayed about 5 years at both. Most CEOs have about a 5-year contract unless they're pushed out. And people talk about how he succeeded. Well, both organizations snapped back to the way they were before he came. I put it like a stretched rubber band. They just came back. And it is amazing to me in my career how people will play an executive, mimic their behaviors, accept their behaviors because they know their career is on the line if they don't. And we've seen that in bad behaviors at places like Mary mentioned them, Wells Fargo and Boeing and VW and others, where fraud was committed because people were afraid of what happened. And as an aside, it's interesting that Martin Vetterkoff, I might have the wrong name. Anyway, it's in my book. The CEO of VW at the time wanted to have a diesel engine ready for the United States market in 2009, was told by the engineers, our diesel engines can't pass California smog rules, very strict rules in California. And he said, I'll find new engineers if you can't do it. And so what they came up with was a dupe system that allowed the cars to perform well when they were idling. And as soon as they took off, they admitted, and they were caught. And people blamed his authoritarianism on what happened. And he said, I don't understand being an authoritarian. My door was always open for people. Well, I've worked around people whose doors were always open. And if you went in and said anything they didn't like, it may be the last thing you ever said. And you had to be very careful of what you said. And that dominates. And so what I'm always concerned about what character does to the culture of an organization. And I don't want to belabor this too much, but A former executive, I was at DuPont, a former executive who ended up being the CEO of the company for a short period of time. He and I re-met at Wharton in an executive program at Wharton Business School at Penn. And he was on the board of Tyco. Tyco had a CEO who many of you, if you ever read business literature, Dennis Kozlowski, who was fired and then later went to jail for absconding with a lot of corporate money, misusing it. And after he was fired, the Tyco board decided to do a forensic evaluation of the company. And what they had found was that they had to fire 90 senior corporate executives to rid the company of the character that Kozlowski had promoted and rewarded of his senior executives. They all were mini Kozlowskis. And most boards don't do that. And so when you look at somebody like Alan Mulally, what struck me is why in those 5 years did he not create successors that shared the character that he wanted to emulate, and left it to the organization? And I think sometimes, and Mary's worked with probably a lot more leaders than I've been around, and I've been around some pretty well-known corporate executives, but they tend to believe that the power of their office gets people to agree, and they believe, like the bobbing heads on the back of a dog, people go like this and they go, oh, we have alignment. And then the people go off and do whatever they want. So that's one of the issues. This teaching AI is really one that I hadn't thought about until this morning. A former colleague of mine runs a consulting business, and he was chastised and attacked by a lot of people on LinkedIn because he used AI to put out a job description. And in part of the job description that AI wrote, it said that people who use the personal pronouns, he, she, they, them, are not welcome. This guy's very conservative. People attacked him and he said, I didn't tell AI to do that. And they said, but you in some way taught AI were the prevailing thing. So it worries me that the people who are controlling AI right now, a lot of the tech bros, as they call them, have characteristics that will show up in AI that we may learn to regret. I do a lot with boards selecting CEOs, and also I've been brought in a number of times board CEO conflicts. And typically, sometimes they're performance, but usually they're character problems that the CEO and the board do not agree on how to relate to one another. And oftentimes I have to sit down with a CEO and say, you understand you report to the board. You understand that the board is the only group that can fire you. Hire you, fire you. And they go, yeah, but. And the board will say they'll talk about performance, but what they're really getting into is character issues. So I usually talk about values and values creating value. And organizations that have what I call first level values that are really embedded in the organization as part of their DNA. And then most organizations, and we're seeing it with the pullback from things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, those who are secondary, where it's only for espoused. And we see this in character. People espouse, this is the way we behave, and everybody in the organization goes, oh, are you kidding? That's not the way. And there is a big difference between how people perceive character and how it's espoused within an organization. I'm just going to end with one thing. I'm always impressed, not that they've always lived it, but the credo of the Johnson and Johnson company, that is a statement of the way the company will be run. And it's, for those not familiar with it, there are basically four paragraphs. And the first is their responsibilities. The first is responsibility to their customers. The second is their responsibility to our employees. The third is to their community. And the final one is to their shareholders. And they've been challenged a number of times. Shouldn't that be the reverse? Shouldn't shareholders be first? And the answer has always been, if we do the first three really well, shareholders will be well served. Now, they haven't always lived those values, but they've used them kind of to test one another. And it would be great if we had a credo like that of character for organizations, of some type of guidance. And so I guess a lot of this, I'm very, very impressed by Mary's work. I keep coming back and reading it. Bill Furlong, who I know is on the call or maybe on the call, her collaborator, Bill, we tried to write some things together. And it's, for me, it's an interesting reflection point of what I've seen and what I continue to work with. So I will leave it at that and turn it back to the group.
Okay, so just to manage expectations, we've got about 20 minutes left on the call. So I'm going to ask Mary, first of all, to just say anything she wants to about what Elliot's just said, but hopefully that won't take too long. And then Julian's got his hand up already. We'll go to questions and discussion as quick as possible.
Importantly, I think governance is a really important place for character. In our studies looking at boards of directors, for example, found that they were overweighting on collaboration and underweighting on accountability as members of the board. And think about that. This is our place where we have our biggest checks and balances. And you get it. If you sit on a board, on what basis will we have great judgment on boards? So I know Bill, who's here, and I are big advocates of, bringing in oversight, regulatory systems, boards of directors, establishing where is character in and evidence of character in organizations. You're going to hear me say back to, values, nice to have, but that they are not the solid grounding of where I would suggest that we probably need to go, because all evidence suggests that if they work very well, it's likely because of the strength of character of the individuals who embody those values, not because they had the values. So it's like the aerodynamics issues of flight. Let's not emulate the flapping of birds' wings because people had values. Let's look to the aerodynamics, the thing that we didn't see, the character of the leaders that embodied it and took the tough decisions in organizations. So for us, it's trying to get to that, character piece and being able to enable that. So Elliot, you and I are certainly on the same page looking at all of these problems and how do we course correct, right, around bringing this architecture of character to the problem. So I'll pause there.
Okay, Julian.
Thanks, Ian. Really, really fascinating afternoon. I just got two reflections that I want to share. The first is that several people have talked about the relationship between character and culture, the culture of the organization, and how these things feed in with each other. And I find it helpful. I'm mainly a writer, and this is home, but I do work with corporates, and I find it really useful to get them to think about, instead of thinking about culture, think about character, think about your corporate character, because that makes the connection much, much more transparent. And I think it does make sense. I think organizations do have something that strongly resembles a character, and it can change over time. And, it's very much driven by example, but also by traditions and history. So I think there's some mileage in actually making that link tighter by talking about the character of the individuals and the character of the organization, and get those in alignment. So that's just a thought. I don't know what Mary thinks of that. The second one is people have talked a bit about performance, the relationship with performance, and there's that nice expression, values create value. And I like that, but I think it's quite important to recognize that the term performance is a normative one. It's not just a straightforward a fact of the matter. Because if you reduce performance to financial bottom line, which is the only thing you can measure directly, then I'm afraid to say good character, good values, and I agree with Mary that character underpins values. You start with character, the values of the individual. It doesn't necessarily lead to greater performance. In a way, you can't possibly be a person of good character if you will always kind of, make a compromise as soon as it hits your bottom line. I mean, there are lots of examples. Unilever is a company which has tried to be more enlightened, and it's had to capitulate a bit because of activist shareholders. Energy is very interesting. Most of the American energy firms basically haven't bothered as much with trying to go into renewables and getting out of fossil fuels as the European ones, and their stocks have performed better. So I think, when we talk about performance, I think we don't want to be too glibly reassuring. Good character will give you good performance. It will give you very good performance, but that's because good performance to anyone who's got any ounce of soul or heart is more about just the financial results at the end of the year. And we all know that. If people just wanted to make as much money as possible, we'd all be in, I don't know, pornography or drugs or something like that. Yeah. And people do care about more than just that. So just a little flag there, but very interesting stuff. Thank you.
Does anybody else want to, Mary, do you want to comment on that? And then anybody else can comment?
Sure. Just put in the chat this two-sided handout we use all the time, which shows the virtues and vices index at the individual level, and then the correspondence to how does that roll up into organization culture. And it's a really practical one. People identify, and as we know in culture of organizations, it's subcultures, so it's not the same geographic differences can exist, business line differences. But what I think is because a very practical way, what we do find is that every organization I've ever worked with loves the midline of that culture chart. That's what their aspiration is, but they're not getting it. Why are they not getting it? We've met the enemy, and it's us. It's our underweighting and overweighting of dimensions of character that is cultivating a culture. So that piece I would really say is hugely practical. That's really the basis of this article, forthcoming article that we have. The performance one, look at, for sure, there are times where you can say, is somebody going to cheat and get better performance for the short term, Enron-ish kinds of things. I don't think that's really the case. Like, we want to risk manage around that stuff and put, make sure that regulators are understanding what's going on so those things don't occur. I think it's confusing for people to say, because this is the idea that people would pick up, you're operating with one hand behind your back if you're operating with character. But we actually lean hard into operating with character, and competence is about getting to that optimal kinds of performance. And it may mean that you've got some real challenging judgments about how you manage stakeholder interests. But really, quite frankly, I think it's a low bar for a lot of people. They're not all that inspired by going after shareholder value. They're actually inspired about going after something else, of which then they get. This is the J&J piece, Elliot. They deliver the shareholder value because they were going for something else. They were inspired by something that brought the best of them to what it is that they were doing. That's why I shared with you the study of the Formula Race team at Western. 30 years they had been hovering around 50th in the world of 500 engineering schools. Highly technical work they were doing, design, manufacture, race a Formula style car. They went from 50th in the world to top 10 within a year. And every other engineering school was saying, how did you guys do this? So I like to lean harder into, we should expect these performance benefits. If you improve psychological safety, you improve employee voice, you improve engagement, you are going to improve performance. So, sure, there are times it's a little tougher around it, but we're actually, I think it is a good place for us to imagine more, right, of our organization.
Okay, Lynn's got her hand up.
Yeah, I want to build on the last conversation, but twist it a bit. Just recently, I attended a corporate governance professional education thing, and it was on elements of risk. But what I realized is, that corporate governance, there's a lot of tabletop exercises, where they're giving situations to the board. And I'm wondering, Mary, because this is a model and you can look at it and say, yeah, that looks good. But I mean, applied by a group into a situation, have you done tabletop exercises such that this comes to life and like which character traits are, I mean, is it useful that way? I mean, of course, I'm always coming from sort of a facilitation point of view.
Sure.
Thoughts?
Well, we certainly do a ton of facilitation, and one of the best areas that we find in just identifying it is in this behavioral forecasting idea. And, because often we're doing, and many of you know Ivey Business School is known for its case studies, like we do a lot of, case-based scenario. Then the unfortunate thing, right, when we're doing cases, we're often saying, what should somebody do or how should they do it? What we want to do is bring attention and character. Who is somebody when they do it? So take any scenario and you can build all sorts of different kinds of scenarios. And we say, if a person has this configuration of character, what do we predict will happen? And everybody predicts the same thing. It's like, we know that conversation is going to go sideways. It's a bit back to the water cooler example, Gary, that you gave us. If we actually, know that we can see these are the patterns of character of the individuals, when they come together, can we predict what will be the outcome of it? Yes. So then the answer is, well, can we activate on the character to change the outcome of the scenario? Or can we develop the character of the individuals to change the outcome of the scenario? So I think, Lynn, that is hugely, this behavioral forecasting using character is a really powerful methodology.
Okay, is anybody, particularly anybody that hasn't had a say for a while, does anybody else want to say anything? Yeah, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Actually, I really find it intriguing that actually Elliot brought up Alan Mulally because he really is the epitome of really good character leadership because he's not only succeeded with Boeing and turning that around and saving it from going bust, especially during the 9/11 attacks, but he really rescued Ford and bringing his working together management philosophy. When you're taking a look at his 11 principles, they really all are about being good character and being kind and being transparent and all the things that we're talking about within the character wheel. It just seems that now that Alan Mulally's not in the business world, he's more on like board of directors and stuff like that. We're not really looking to these leaders as really the model because it seems how there seems to be a set point for other leaders that are kind of going back to the old way of doing business because that's the way it's been done within, their business or MBAs and stuff like that. And also, it seems that there's such a responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to the stakeholders that we don't really seem to be doesn't seem to be a lot of practice going on for protecting the people over the profits. And I think, bringing up Alan Mulally, talking about individuals like that is a really huge piece if we want to really espouse some of these character traits as identified by Ivey School of Business.
Elliot, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jamie. I've got a lot of respect for what Mulally did, and I've worked around some people that don't have the same notoriety, but had tried to do the same thing. And it goes back to what I was saying about Tycho and what the board had to do with ridding itself of whatever. The culture, and I think it was you, Jamie, that put in there, the culture of both Boeing and Ford were so deep that 5 years wasn't enough to really change it. Um, the so the question I have in my own mind is, why can good character like Mullally not change an organization, but bad character can change it really quickly? And I'm reminded, some of you may follow and know Scott Galloway, who is a professor at the Stern School of Business at NYU, who's on every talk show and everything, has his own podcast. And he was talking about what he sees with young men, either in the university, or the fact that a lot of young men are not going on to higher education university. And he said, I'm worried about what young men see as and this is a paraphrase, as the kind of exemplars of behavior. And I'm worried what will happen to young men in the next 4 years that Trump and Musk are considered what they should emulate. Now, without politics or whatever, this kind of strong, just break it, try to put it back together. And we can see in the United States politics that Trump's popularity is waning, except with young men. It's going up. They seem to like this macho behavior. And Atlantic had a piece, and I don't want to get into that, but that's what troubles me, is why good behavior is fleeting and bad behavior tends to really change things so quickly. And it's just something that I've lived with and I keep looking at, wondering about.
Okay, Andy, do you want to make a comment? We're going to have to be quite quick on this because we're coming up to time.
Yeah, apologies. I've joined late, so I've missed most of the conversation. But what you said, Elliot, prompted me to think about some work I've been reading recently. I don't know if people are familiar with Mary Harrington as a philosopher, but this deeper notion of who am I, and from where the conception of the self, which then brings forward that which is important, that which is not. And she's talked quite interestingly about how that sense has shifted over time, that in pre-modern times we would see ourselves more as a soul, and there'd be sort of more sacred attachments, deeper relationships. That's evolved through the modern era into the self. So the soul has become the self, and in the postmodern era it's become identity. And identity is much more playing to the crowd, if you like, than a deeper sense of what soul might speak to. And therefore, those things which I can do, which draw attention to my identity, that I can optimize, I can show to other, that kind of more superficial way of manifesting one's character to speak to identity is shifting what people are attending to. And her call is that we maybe need to think more, or think about how we can go much more to a soul-based identity than the identity politics and the identity that we all are in the game of maximizing at the moment, which can shape how our character expresses itself.
Mary, can you respond to the last few comments in 1 minute?
Well, first of all, I and there's some also in the chat. Character is a wonderful place that brings, I think, psychology, sociology, understanding, like why, Elliot, we know sociologists, you look at Zimbardo, bad apples, bad barrels, bad barrel makers, right? We do know these things can have, really significant consequences. I love the idea of soul, self, and identity. And I do think character, I really think we're at a place where you have those conversations, because through the development of character, you start to address, who am I? What am I about? What are my core beliefs about what matters? What's important? What matters to me, others, the world? It's this incredibly practical yet deep space that it will hold everything we have to give it. It will hold. I know that from all of the years I've been working in it. You look at all the questions, answering performance questions or EDI questions or risk management or culture. It's real bedrock. I saw that in the chat. it has incredible promise, and I hope that people begin to see that it's really practical and important work.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen again and just explain that the session today was part of the first Salon series, Inflection. And you're probably wondering what character and leadership have got to do with the title, the subject Inflection. But I believe that we're at an inflection point in human development, and it requires better character and good leadership if we're going to inflect and make go in a positive direction in the future. We need to make better choices, wide choices. We need better governance and so on. So that's how this all relates. But do go to the Salon page on Substack. You should be able to find it quite easily. It's the EA Salon. And just moving to the next slide quickly. On YouTube channel for the Enlightened Enterprise Academy, you can find all of the recordings of the interviews in the series so far. And next up in the series, which will be following on from the conversation today, because I'm really trying to curate the conversation so that it flows. So on the slightly earlier time, but on the 26th of March, we've got the session like today with Mary Gentili. And early next week, I'll be publishing the interview that I've already done with Mary, so that you can watch that in advance of the live session and prepare any questions you might have about that. But quite often, having the ability to be able to say what you think is a challenge in an organization. We've heard that several times during the conversation today, especially if you've got very domineering leaders and it's a large organization and so on. How does somebody in middle management actually say something if they think their values are being attacked and that they're not happy with what's going on? So another Mary, has been doing a lot of work in this area for a very long time, and she'll be explaining what she's learnt, working in a whole range of different sectors, well, pretty much every sector you can think of. So do join us for that session, and do look out for the interview, which I should be able to publish on Monday, Tuesday next week. And finally, just a plug for the Enlightened Enterprise Academy. What we're trying to do and what we're arguing is there's got to be a more enlightened way of doing lots of the things that we're not doing very well these days. We need more enlightened approaches to the way in which we conduct enterprise, and enterprise doesn't only happen in business, it happens in every single sector that we can think about. So check out what we're up to by taking a look at the website, enlightenedenterprise.ac for Academy. And on that, and just about, a minute or two over time, I'm going to stop and thank our guests today, Mary especially, but also thanks very much to Gary and Elliot and everybody else that's joined and contributed. I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can say goodbye to each other. Thanks very much
everybody.
Indeed.
Great conversation.
Cheers.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.